You're listening to the story of a broken man, a lost woman, and a storm that brought them together. This is the tale of a struggling cowboy who found more than he expected in the snow. And what she did next would change his life forever. The year was 1877, and winter had arrived early in the Wyoming territory. The wind that swept across the high plains carried a bitterness that gnawed at the bones. For Caleb Hale, a widowed rancher and father, the cold was no stranger. It was as familiar to him as the ache in his back and the emptiness in his chest. His ranch sat in a lonely dip of the land, miles from Redemption, the nearest town. Redemption, an ironic name, Caleb often thought. He hadn't felt redeemed in years. His home was modest, nothing more than a cabin of hand-hewn logs and chinked mud, patched with hope and endurance. It stood as a monument to stubbornness, not comfort. Every fence post was a battle won. Every head of cattle a fragile victory against a harsh land and lurking predators, human and otherwise. 3 years earlier, his world had collapsed. Fever had swept through their cabin, stealing his wife, Martha, in just 2 days. She had been the fire in the hearth, the laughter in the air, the soft hand that braided their daughter's hair. When she died, she took the music of life with her, and the silence that followed had never quite lifted. Now, Caleb's days were shaped by habit and necessity. Wake before dawn, feed the livestock, repair what the wind and time had broken, cook plain meals, read to Abigail by firelight, then collapse into sleep, only to repeat it all the next day. His life had become a loop, slow, grinding walk through grief disguised as survival. Abigail, 6 years old, was the quiet center of his storm-wrecked life. She rarely spoke, though her eyes, wide and solemn like her mother's, spoke volumes. She clung to the ragged calico doll Martha had made, holding it as if it still carried her mother's scent. Caleb did what he could. He sewed her dresses with clumsy fingers, told her stories his own father once told him, and tried to make her smile. But it often felt like trying to light a fire with wet wood. And then the storm came. It struck without warning, tearing down from the mountains in a howl of sleet and wind. One moment, the sky was bruised with gray. The next, it was devouring the light. Caleb was out by the far fence line when the temperature plunged and the wind began to roar. He ran back, head down, breath frosting in his beard, snow biting at his skin. Inside the cabin, Abigail was curled by the hearth, eyes wide and frightened. The fire was weak, the cabin walls groaning under the pressure of the wind. Caleb threw on more logs, added blankets, and sealed the door as best he could. For 2 days, they were trapped. The storm screamed outside like a banshee, burying the land in endless white. The snow piled in drifts that swallowed fence lines and transformed familiar paths into a hostile maze. Caleb ventured out only briefly to check on the animals in the lean-to. Each trip was perilous. Abigail, usually quiet, clung to him more than usual during those long days. Her small hand sought his whenever the wind howled too loudly or the cabin creaked too deeply. Caleb held her close and tried not to let her see his worry. If the roof collapsed, if they ran out of food, if she fell ill. The thoughts circled like wolves outside the door. On the third morning, the storm broke. Sunlight returned, glaring against the pristine snow. The world had been transformed, beautiful, deadly, and utterly foreign. Caleb stood at the cabin door, breathing in the cold air. He needed to check the property. The cattle could have strayed, fallen, or worse, leaving Abigail with instructions to feed the fire and not open the door for anyone. He strapped on his snowshoes, grabbed his rifle, and headed out into the silence. Snow crunched beneath him, muffled and deep. The land looked unfamiliar, reshaped by wind and storm. As he neared the creek bend, he spotted something strange. At first, he thought it might be a fallen calf, but calves didn't wear buckskin. It was a person. His breath caught in his throat as he approached. It was a woman, native by the look of her clothing. She was small, still, half buried in snow, her hair iced to her face. His rifle hung forgotten at his side. As he knelt, 1,000 thoughts raced through his mind. What if someone saw him bringing her back? What would the town say? What if her people came looking for her? Then he touched her neck. Dare barely, but there a pulse, a faint thrum beneath cold skin. Like a bird trapped beneath ice, she was alive. He looked up at the vast, empty land around him. No one else would find her out here. No one else was coming. Leaving her wasn't an option, not for a man who still saw Martha's pale face every time he closed his eyes. So he lifted her into his arms light as a whisper and turned back toward the cabin, not knowing how this would end, only knowing he couldn't leave her behind. Caleb kicked open the cabin door, snow swirling in behind him as he carried the unconscious woman inside. Kay, still curled near the hearth, jumped to her feet. Her eyes widened as she saw the stranger in her father's arms. But she didn't speak, just watched, clutching her doll tightly. Caleb gently laid the woman on his own narrow cot, the only extra bed in the room. Her skin was pale, lips tinged blue, and her buckskin clothes were soaked and torn. Abigail moved closer, her expression serious and still. Caleb turned to her, voice low but firm. Water, clean rags. From the chest, he said. Abigail hesitated for only a second, then ran to fetch what he asked. Caleb began the slow, careful work of assessing the woman's injuries. There was a nasty gash on her forehead, swollen and angry, but it didn't feel like the skull was fractured. The real concern was her leg badly punctured, the flesh torn where a jagged branch had speared. Through it, he cleaned the wound as best he could, his hands trembling more than he liked to admit. She groaned, a raw, guttural sound that made Abigail step back in alarm. Then her eyelids fluttered. Her eyes opened, dark, unfocused, wild with panic. She tried to sit up, breath ragged, and let out a hoarse cry. Caleb pressed her back gently. Easy. You're safe, he said, holding up the rag and bowl to show her what he was doing. She stared at him, confused and frightened, but didn't fight. Her eyes shifted to Abigail and softened slightly. Even in her pain, something about the child anchored her. Drink. Caleb asked, motioning. He offered a tin cup of water. She sipped it slowly, shakily, as he rewrapped the wound. She didn't speak, but he didn't expect her to. Not yet. That night, the woman dozed fitfully, feverish and murmuring in a language Caleb couldn't understand. He kept the fire burning high and checked on her every hour. Abigail sat close by, too restless to sleep. At one point, she crept over and placed her doll beside the sleeping woman. Caleb's throat tightened. By morning, the fever had settled somewhat. Her breathing eased. She looked around the cabin more alertly, but still said nothing. When she next woke, she gestured weakly to herself and whispered a single word, Winona. Caleb nodded. Winona, he repeated, then touched his own chest. Caleb, he gestured to the child. Abigail. Winona's eyes lingered on Abigail, who gave a shy wave. There was no smile, but something flickered behind Winona's guarded gaze. The days passed in a quiet routine. Caleb continued tending her injuries, checking the livestock, and keeping the cabin warm. Winona rarely spoke, but she watched everything. Caleb noticed the subtle signs, the way her lips tightened when she was in pain, the slight wince when she moved, the occasional glance toward Abigail. Her leg was slow to heal, the wound deep and angry. Caleb feared infection, but Winona endured the treatments without complaint. He moved her cot closer to the fire, hung a blanket for privacy. Though they all knew it was symbolic in a single-room cabin, Abigail, sensing the fragile shift in their world, grew less timid. She brought small offerings, wildflowers, a shiny pebble, a strip of ribbon she'd found in her mother's things. One afternoon, she offered Winona a torn dress to mend. Caleb didn't expect anything to come of it. But later that evening, Winona held up the dress perfectly repaired, the stitches tiny and precise. Caleb was quietly amazed. It wasn't just mending, it was a message. "I didn't know you could sew like that," he said softly. She gave a faint nod, then looked away. Abigail beamed. She hugged the dress to her chest and ran to show it to her father. Caleb caught Winona watching the girl, her face unreadable but no longer cold. Over time, Caleb noticed changes. The silence between them wasn't so heavy anymore. Though they still spoke little, they communicated in gestures and glances. He could tell when Winona was hungry, when she was cold, when she needed help sitting up. She understood when he asked her to watch the fire or hand him tools. He began to notice the small ways she contributed, tidying up, gathering kindling, boiling water without being asked. She wasn't just surviving. She was reclaiming a place in the world, bit by bit. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the frozen ridges, Abigail brought in a bundle of wildflowers she had found beneath the melting snow near the cabin. She offered them to Winona without a word. Winona took them gently, fingers trembling slightly. She wove them into a tiny, perfect crown, then placed it on Abigail's head. Abigail's face lit up. "It's beautiful," she whispered, throwing her arms around Winona in a spontaneous hug. Winona froze for a heartbeat, then slowly, almost hesitantly, turned the embrace. From the doorway, Caleb saw it all. His throat ached. Delicate. It was the first time he'd seen such warmth in Abigail's eyes since Martha died. And he saw something else too. The barest hint of a smile softening Winona's worn face. They had survived the storm. But something deeper was shifting now, something gentler, unexpected. A bond forming not through words, but through shared stillness, mutual need, and the fragile trust born of kindness. As Caleb added another log to the fire that night, he looked over at the two figures by the hearth, his daughter leaning on the shoulder of the woman who, just days ago, had been a stranger in the snow. And he thought to himself, maybe, just maybe, this house didn't feel so empty anymore. Winter loosened its grip by slow degrees. The snow softened, revealing patches of earth as brown and scarred as the people who lived on it. The days stretched longer, the light warmer, and with the thaw came something more dangerous than frost. Rumors died inside the cabin. Life had begun to take on a rhythm that felt almost normal. Winona was no longer just the injured woman in the corner. Her leg, though still stiff and scarred, had begun to heal. She moved with a cane Caleb had carved from a piece of aspen. Her steps were slow but steady. Her presence, once cautious and watchful, became quietly essential. She helped wherever she could, chopping vegetables, preparing broth, collecting herbs from the edges of the thawing woods. Abigail shadowed her constantly, hungry for attention and warmth that only a maternal figure could offer. Under Winona's gentle guidance, Abigail bloomed like spring grass. Caleb watched it all with a mixture of relief and a cautious sort of wonder. He wasn't used to softness anymore. Yet, there it was, in the small ways Winona tucked a blanket around Abigail, or stirred the stew without needing to be asked, or caught Caleb's eye across the cabin with a flicker of something like understanding. He didn't ask questions. She didn't offer stories. They simply worked and existed, quietly building something fragile but real. But peace on the frontier never went unnoticed for long. It started with tracks. One morning, Caleb rode into Redemption for supplies, flour, salt, nails. He kept to himself, nodding politely to the shopkeeper and trying not to linger. But the air felt different. It followed him more than usual. Conversations hushed when he walked by at the general store. Amos Blackwood was waiting, tall and sharp-jawed. With a sneer he never quite dropped. Blackwood was the kind of man who believed his name gave him the right to speak for others. He stepped in front of Caleb at the counter, voice too loud. "Strange weather lately," said, not bothering to disguise the bite in his tone. "Heard there's been more smoke coming from your chimney than usual. Figured you were alone out there." Caleb didn't respond. He placed his items on the counter and waited. Blackwood leaned closer. "Some of the boys riding patrol said they saw footprints, small ones, and extra firewood stacked high like you're keeping more than just your little girl warm." The room fell into a tense hush. Caleb met his stare. "My land. My firewood," he said flatly. "You got a problem." "That depends," Blackwood replied. "You keeping someone out there? Someone who don't belong?" Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. He listened close. "Hale," Blackwood said, voice low now, coiled with menace. "You bring one of them into this town, you're bringing trouble. You'd do well to send her back. For your own sake." Caleb returned to the cabin. He was quieter than usual. Winona noticed. She always noticed. He told her what had happened, briefly, bluntly. Winona didn't flinch, but her gaze dropped to the floor. "I go," she said simply. "No trouble for you, or Abigail." The words struck like a slap. Caleb shook his head. "No, that's not happening." He looked at her, then truly looked at her, the quiet strength in her posture, the care she gave to Abigail. It's the way she'd stitched herself into their lives without asking for anything in return. "You have a place here," he said. "You've earned it." She looked up, and for a moment, something passed between them, a kind of wordless agreement. Not love, not yet, but respect, trust. 2 days later, the threat arrived at their door. Caleb had seen them coming, Blackwood and 2 other riders, all armed, all angry. He stepped outside before they could knock, his shotgun resting in the crook of his arm. "Where is she?" Blackwood demanded. "She's not your concern. This town won't stand for it. We got laws." "Hale?" "No," Caleb replied. "You got fear, and fear don't give you the right to threaten my home." One of the other men, Jasper Donovan, shifted in his saddle. "She's an outsider. You're risking your daughter, your land, everything. I'm protecting someone who needed help, just like I'd hoped someone would do for my girl if she was out there in the snow." The standoff simmered, and then the cabin door creaked open. Winona stepped out, not hiding, not cowed. She wore one of Martha's old dresses, clean and patched. Her braids were neat, her chin held high. She looked directly at Blackwood and spoke slowly, clearly. "I bring no harm. I was lost. Caleb saved me. His daughter. She is good. I only want peace." There was a long silence. Then a younger rider, someone Caleb didn't recognize, cleared his throat. "She don't look like no threat. If he says he found her hurt, I believe him." Blackwood's face twisted. "You siding with him?" "I'm siding with sense," the man replied. "Hey, maybe a little decency." Blackwood spat into the snow. "This ain't over," he growled. "You'll regret this." He turned his horse sharply and rode off, followed by Donovan. The third rider lingered, gave Caleb a nod, then followed. Inside, the tension lingered like smoke. Winona sat by the hearth, brushing Abigail's hair. Caleb leaned against the doorframe, watching. "That was brave," he said quietly. "I have been afraid before," she replied. "I will not live that way again." Abigail reached for Winona's hand, small fingers curling around hers. Winona didn't flinch. Outside, the wind had changed direction. Not warmer, not safer, but different. Caleb knew the storm wasn't over. But as he looked at the 2 figures bathed in firelight, he also knew something else. They weren't alone anymore. For a while, everything remained still, too still, like the eerie quiet after a thunderclap. Caleb didn't relax. He couldn't, though Blackwood and his men had ridden off without bloodshed. The threat lingered like smoke trapped in the rafters. At night, Caleb kept his rifle close. During the day, he reinforced the cabin doors, checked the shutters, and moved with a watchful edge to every step. But Winona, she remained calm, not careless, just steady. She went about her chores with quiet purpose, cooking, mending, gathering herbs from near the creek. Abigail clung to her side with a kind of fierce devotion that Caleb hadn't seen since before Martha passed. The girl laughed more now. She smiled without prompting. When Winona knelt to braid her hair in the mornings, Abigail would chatter softly, telling little stories, asking questions. Caleb marveled at the change. It wasn't just that Winona had saved Abigail's health during the long nights of her fever weeks ago, was that she had gently begun to heal something deeper, something that had been hollow and silent in their home for years. One afternoon, Caleb returned from checking the pasture and found Abigail and Winona seated by the fire, crafting small figures from river clay. Tiny animals, birds, and people, shaped by patient hands. Abigail was giggling as she tried to form a bear. Winona smiled faintly and helped smooth the rough edges. That smile so rare, so quiet, stayed with Caleb long after he hung his coat. Despite the outward calm, Caleb knew it was only a matter of time before Blackwood stirred trouble again. The pick man wasn't one to let things go, especially not after losing face. So Caleb taught Winona how to bolt the doors, where the rifle was stored, how to use it if she had to. She listened, never flinching, never questioning his judgment. But when he offered to teach her to shoot, she declined with a slight shake of her head. "I know how to defend myself," she said simply. There was no bravado in her tone, just truth. Still, the tension never fully lifted. Each knock on the door sent a charge through Caleb's chest. Each set of hoofbeats in the distance made him pause. But Winona never showed fear. She met each day with quiet dignity, focusing on Abigail, on healing, on routine. In doing so, she anchored the home in something stronger than fear. One morning, as Caleb prepared to ride into town for supplies, a heaviness settled in his chest. He hated leaving them, Winona and Abigail, alone, even for a few hours. But the food stores were low, and the weather was finally mild enough to make the journey bearable. Before he left, he pulled Winona aside. "Keep out of sight," he said. "Bolt the door. Don't answer for anyone but me." She nodded, her expression unreadable, but her eyes said she understood. "Come back safe," she said softly. Those 3 words, simple, ordinary, caught Caleb off guard. No one had told him that in a long, long time. He gave a stiff nod and rode out, not looking back until the cabin was just a dot behind him. The trip into redemption was uneventful till he reached the general store inside. Blackwood was already there, pretending to browse, but keeping a close eye on Caleb. There was no confrontation this time, but the tension crackled like dry brush. A few men muttered as Caleb passed, their eyes cold, their mouths tight. He paid for his supplies quickly and left without a word. As he mounted his horse, he caught sight of Jasper Donovan watching from across the street. The man said nothing, spat into the dirt, and smirked. On the way home, Caleb pushed the horse hard, uneasy. When he arrived back at the cabin, he found Abigail and Winona sitting outside on a blanket, sorting through dried herbs. Abigail ran to him, hugging his legs. "I helped make tea," she announced proudly. Winona looked up and gave a small nod of greeting, her eyes studying him closely. "All quiet?" he asked. "Yes," she replied. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Later that night, they ate together, stew thick with rabbit meat and roots Winona had foraged. Abigail chatted happily between bites, her cheeks flushed from the fire. After the dishes were cleaned and Abigail tucked into bed, Caleb and Winona found themselves alone at the hearth. The fire crackled low, casting warm light across the worn floorboards. Caleb hesitated, then spoke. "They'll come again. Blackwood won't let this go." Winona stirred the fire with a stick, her expression calm. "Then we will be ready." Nodded slowly, watching her. "You've brought something into this home I didn't realize was missing," he said. "It's not just Abigail, it's me, too." Winona looked at him, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. "I don't want you to go," Caleb said finally. She didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "I have nowhere to go. You have here." The words hung in the air between them, not quite a promise. Not yet, but something real. The next morning, the storm came not of snow, but of men. Blackwood returned, flanked by Donovan and a few others, armed, angry. Caleb saw them ride up and met them before they could dismount. "We've come for the squaw," Blackwood said flatly, using the word like a blade. Caleb's voice was calm but firm. "Her name is Winona, and she's under my protection." "She's not one of us," Blackwood snapped. "She doesn't belong here." "She belongs here more than you," Caleb said. Donovan reached for his pistol. "Don't," Caleb warned, leveling his shotgun. "You'll regret it." Then, from behind him, the door opened. Winona stepped onto the porch, standing tall, chin lifted, hands at her sides. Beside her, Abigail held her hand tightly, unafraid. Winona's voice rang out, steady and clear. "I bring no harm. This man saved me. His child is good, but I wish only peace." Even Blackwood faltered. One of the younger riders shifted uncomfortably. "She don't look like trouble. Hale's always done right by his land." Blackwood glared at him. "So that's it? You're siding with them?" "Siding with what's right," the young man said. Blackwood's eyes blazed. But this time, the tide had turned. With a curse, he swung his horse around and rode off, his men following some reluctantly. Caleb stood there, shotgun still in hand, chest rising and falling. Winona turned to him. "It's over. For now," he said. She nodded, and for the first time, he saw tears in her eyes. Not of fear, but of something else entirely. The riders were gone, but the weight of their presence lingered like boot prints in the snow. Caleb didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window with his rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the horizon, listening for hoofbeats that never came. Winona didn't sleep either. She stayed up tending to Abigail, who had grown anxious after the confrontation. The girl had seen something something children shouldn't have to witness, but she didn't cry. She curled close to Winona, under the quilts, and held tightly to her hand until her breathing evened out. Caleb glanced over and saw the silhouette of Winona gently stroking the girl's hair. Her head bent low. He didn't say anything, just watched, a lump forming in his throat. There was something about the way she carried herself, so steady, so calm, as if all her pain and fear had long ago been folded into something stronger. He realized then that she wasn't just surviving. Anymore, she was choosing to stay. In the weeks that followed, the air grew warmer. Spring seeped into the ground, and with it came change now fast, not loud, but steady. Winona's leg continued to heal. She began to move without her cane, limping only slightly. The cabin, once a place of echoing grief, now echoed with laughter, with footsteps, with the occasional off-key humming of a child playing. Abigail blossomed like a flower in new soil. She followed Winona like a shadow, learning, copying, growing. Winona taught her the names of herbs, how to boil pine needles into tea, how to stitch a simple seam, how to recognize the signs of changing weather by watching the sky and the trees. Sometimes, Caleb would come in from the fields to find the two of them kneeling by the hearth, whispering stories to each other. Abigail would look up and grin. Winona would offer a smile that was no longer rare, but real. The house, once a place of mourning, had become a place of movement and memory. a place of life, and Winona. She didn't try to replace Martha. She didn't have to. She simply existed in the spaces that had been empty for too long, filling them not with loud declarations, but with quiet presence. She understood grief without needing it explained. Her own past was marked with lost family, taken by sickness and conflict. Her tribe scattered and driven from their land. She spoke of it only once. Late one evening, when the fire had burned down to embers, "I lost them in the winter," she said. "My people. I was alone, walking in the storm. I didn't think I'd wake again." Caleb said nothing, but he reached out his calloused hand, closing around hers. 2 people, 2 losses, 2 long winters. And now, 1 home. There were still whispers and redemption, of course. Small towns never truly forget, but no one came to the cabin again. Blackwood kept his distance, and the younger rider Shaw, as Caleb learned it, occasionally nodded when they crossed paths in town. "You did what was right," Shaw told him once, without fanfare. "Don't let anyone tell you different." Caleb nodded. He wasn't looking for approval, but it was good to hear by early summer. Life on the ranch had taken on a new rhythm. Winona became not just a guest, not just a helper, but an essential part of everything. She wove traps that brought fresh meat to the table. She taught Caleb how to use plant sap to mend boots, how to set snare lines that wouldn't spook the animals, how to see the land not as something to conquer, but as something to read. Under her guidance, Abigail's world expanded too. The little girl grew bold, confident. Shyness gave way to curiosity. She climbed trees, told long, meandering stories, and brought home bugs, feathers, and shiny stones. She laughed a sound that had once been rare enough to break Caleb's heart. Now it was common. Now it was part of their mornings. One afternoon, as the sun set behind the hills in a wash of amber and lavender, Caleb stood at the edge of the pasture. He watched the cabin smoke curling gently from the chimney, Winona's figure moving inside, Abigail skipping just behind her with her hair in a loose braid. He exhaled slowly. The ache was still there. Martha's absence, still a shadow in the corners, but it didn't hurt the same way anymore. Loss had carved a hollow in him, and somehow Winona and Abigail had filled it not by replacing what was gone, but by giving it purpose. Caleb returned to the cabin as the last light faded. That night, as they sat by the fire, Abigail asleep on a bed of blankets and firelight dancing across the walls, Winona looked over at him. "This home," she said quietly, "is strong." Caleb nodded. "It is, because of you." "No," she replied, eyes meeting his, "because we are strong, together." He reached over and took her hand again this time without hesitation. The wind outside had changed. It no longer whispered of hardship. It carried the quiet tune of a new song.